So, Professor Dantzig, we've had a lot of conversations in the past about the history of linear programming, and we all call you the father of linear programming. So, can you tell the story of how things began?
Well, I can tell you how I became the father of linear programming. I was invited, this was in the very early days, I was invited to Japan, and I came off the plane, and the people who were my hosts kept looking for me because they couldn't find me, because they had the vision that the one who originated linear programming would be an old man. And those days I was still very young. And so that's the way I became the father of linear programming. They named me.
So now, how did the work in linear programming begin?
Well, it certainly didn't begin as linear programming. It was part of the aftermath of World War II. There was a effort on the part of my friends in the Pentagon to keep me there. I was looking for an academic job at the time, and I had all during the war I had been doing planning and things of this sort, and they tried to find some reason for my staying. These were two people. One was named Marshall Wood, and the other was named escape me, Tal Hitchcock.
That's the same Hitchcock as the Hitchcock?
No, not that one.
Not that, different Hitchcock. Okay.
I don't know which one you're talking about. There's a Hitchcock.
There's the Hitchcock-Koopman's transportation problem.
No, not that one.
Not that one.
That Hitchcock was a professor at MIT, and at the time that he wrote that, it was towards the end of his life, and I think it was the only thing he did.
Oh, okay.
And I never met him, but he did exist in my time.
Okay. So at the Pentagon, Marshall Wood and Al Hitchcock were trying to find a way to have you stay.
Yeah, so during the war, I was head of a group which is called Combat Analysis, and it was part of statistical control. And it was a big position, and Tex Thornton, who was head of it, later on became head of Litton Industries. And I don't know if you remember, there's a new building near campus. It was a legacy of Tex Thornton. So during the war, I was in charge of a group which is called Combat Analysis, but I was also did a lot of work in helping other groups within the Pentagon do planning under planning. Then the war ended, and I went out to Berkeley to finish my PhD. That was one semester. And then I came back to the Pentagon because Berkeley made me an offer, but I didn't like it. It was too small. Or to be more exact, my wife didn't like it. It was a grand salary of $1,400 a year. She didn't see how we could live on that and have a child too. So she said no. So I went back to the Pentagon to look around for another job. So I was actively looking in this was June of 46, June of 46. I was actively looking for a job in university, and had received a number of offers and received a number of on-offers, and they looked for something that I might do, keep me in interest. And the idea came up to mechanize the planning process. Before that, in the Pentagon, was all done by hand.
Now, what kinds of planning were they doing by hand at that time?
Well, they were, if you want to know the war effort was an enormous effort. And it took place in a period of about 4 years. And by the end of the war, it was essentially doing the same thing, planning a whole country, done on an enormous scale. And we developed all kinds of special techniques for doing it by hand.
So they were looking to plan the different operations in terms of deployment of forces and logistics?
Right. And then it was complete from the logistics of nuts and bolts, to training of people, to the getting of airplanes, manufacturing of airplanes, everything that was going on. And the scale of operations just blows your mind. And so there were hundreds of thousands of different kinds of material goods. There were maybe 50,000 specialties of people. And while my office was in charge of the actual combat itself, keeping track of the number of sorties flown, that sort of thing, the casualties, the attrition rates. I was also sort of, I'll say hired out, but that's of course not correct. Nobody paid me to work with various parts of the Air Force on their planning and their. So I became a skilled expert and doing it by essentially the hand techniques.
Well, there was no, at the time, they were just trying to see, plan how are we going to get this done without any worrying about trying to do it efficiently. Is that correct?
Well, of course, we always pretended we were doing it efficiently. And so we developed various techniques. But at the end of the war, everything began to dissolve and break up. And people went their own ways. And their own ways meant getting out of the military work and going back to civilian life again. So my process of looking for a job after I finished my PhD was to find an academic job. But I looked at other places as well.
Now, at the Defense Department, you began to work on the planning problems that led to one of the first papers, which was programming in a linear structure. So what were there specific models that you had in mind at that time in the development of the linear programming model?
They paralleled very closely what was done in the military planning. In other words, we weren't trying to depart completely from the planning process that the Air Force was using. In fact, all we were trying to do was speed it up and do it more quickly and to organize it.
Now, when the first development came, you came up with the linear programming model, and then there was the development of the Simplex method.
That was the order in which things happened, yes.
And once the method was developed, was it then used by hand immediately to solve some of these planning problems?
You gotta remember, there wasn't any computers.
Right.
I mean, it was a great idea. Everybody immediately saw that it had great potential. And so we went through the game that we were going to do the whole planning process using computers. And in fact, we were responsible for actually getting money from the Air Force and from the military to the manufacturers to build computers and to do the research on them. So
I've always tried to look for connections between the early developments of computers and the first UNIVACs that occurred at Pennsylvania and the development of linear programming at the time. Can you describe some of those connections?
the idea of developing a computer was the people like the University of Pennsylvania, Eckert and Mockley, Eckert and John Mockley, I think John was his first name.
Were some of the computers that were being built by the manufacturers then built really for the applications of linear programming?
Yes.
And
of course there were other people that had different ideas.
So how early would you say was the military able to realize some of the benefits of the models and then the algorithm for solving these models?
I'd say a 10 years period. In other words, 1945 saw the beginning of this field.
Now,
But it wasn't until 1955 that any of the computers really worked.
right. So, but prior to that, there were problems that you solved by hand.
All problems were solved
By hand. So, can you tell us sort of about the first applications of linear programming that you did solve by hand?
There was something called the Berlin airlift. At the time, we were having a lot of trouble with the Russians, and they had blockaded Berlin, so that the American and Allied forces, other than Russia, were like prisoners in the middle of Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that supplies were coming into Berlin at all was via airplanes. The United States and Britain had control of an airfield in the Berlin area, and we were flying in supplies. And so there was one program that we invented called the Berlin Airlift, which set up the logistics of it, and we solved that problem.
Now,
But it was all pretend, because there were no computers to solve
right.
the problem.
So by hand, I mean, essentially you were, at that time, it was the tableau method of what we call today the tableau pivoting method of simplex method that you would be doing by hand.
No, it was more primitive than that. We just laid out a schedule, like you would
I see.
for doing it.
Now, what would you say would be the first problems that were practically solved with the simplex method by hand or by computer?
I'd say the diet problem.
And do you recall when that was done?
think it was done early in the 1950s when I was at Rand Corporation.
Okay. And now, and would you say when that particular problem was solved, was that also done by hand? Or was it,
There was a man by the name of Stieglitz, and he wrote a paper called The Diet Problem.
right.
And he also outlined how he solved the problem, and he wrote it up. So, and how he guessed the problem, how he guessed the optimal solution.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first things that we did is that I was looking around for a problem to illustrate how this Simplex method worked, and I got in touch with some friends I had and from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. One of them was Jerry Cornfield, another fellow named Dwayne Evans, and we all met, and they suggested that we try it out on the diet problem. And I tried to get a hold of it, and Jerry Cornfield said that he had prepared material to be for it, and he would get it for me. So he got me part of the problem. Then I had to go to the economics unit of you may recall stuff 50 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a little bit rusty on it. So these, I guess, were before you were born.
That's right.
Well, anyway, I decided that would be a good problem, a show problem.
And when you solved the problem at that point, it was by hand pivoting.
Yes.
And so it was just a bunch of people working together to do the arithmetic.
And there's a fellow that worked for the Bureau of Standards. The Bureau of Standards had a group of a computation group located in New York City, and so I arranged with a fellow by the name of Jack Laderman to have the computations done, and it was done by hand in New York City. And what Jack Laderman did is he got, let's say, 30 different people working on it at the same simultaneously. So we had a parallel operation going on. So the problem had about, as a linear program, it had about 10 rows, and it had about close to 100 different foods. And the diet problem, you would select the optimal diet. And so he partialed it out to his various helpers. Let's say there were a whole bunch, I don't know how many. But they each had a little piece of this tableau,
Okay.
which they did the operations on. And they were all on individual little pieces of paper like this. But it was really one big tableau, very, very long, and not too deep. And then he pasted it all together. So it looked like one
Okay.
sheet. So this is the way the first one was solved.
I know you've
And
told.
by the way,
Oh.
the answer that Stieglitz got was wrong. He did not find the optimal solution.
Oh, really?
Ours was 36 cents cheaper.
Oh, I see.
This was for a whole year.
Yeah, there's actually a new paper Saul Gass did with I think when looked at the old problem in today's prices and then did a more modern version, like certain foods that we eat today that we wouldn't eat yesterday, or vice versa, and resolved it. So I skimmed it quickly, but that was just appeared within the past month.
Right.
So it's still an active problem of interest. I know we've talked about and seen in your book of how Koopmans suggested taking the term programming in a linear structure and create the term linear programming. And later on, we then have now mathematical programming and the Mathematical Programming Society. Today, as we're trying to market optimization, we're using optimization as a word to describe mathematical programming and other methods of optimization. Can you recall at all when optimization started to become used as a word in the field?
Well, the whole idea of an objective function, which of course optimization applies, was not known prior to linear programming. In other words, the idea of optimizing something was something that nobody could do. Nobody tried to optimize. So while you are very happy with it and say it's a very familiar term, optimization just meant doing it better than somebody else. And the whole concept of getting the optimum solution just didn't exist. And so my introducing the whole idea of optimization in the early days was novel.
Well, it was with respect to introducing the objective function over
That's
the set
right.
of constraints.
That's right. If you talk to somebody, they acted like, well, yes, this is optimal. This is better. But it was only in the sense that it was really better. And the fact that it was, you're talking about it in a mathematical sense of the optimum, just was not part of the realistic vocabulary. So, and in fact, you're in your letter to me stressing the idea that this optimization is a popular term these days was a surprise, because I don't think of this as being a popular concept, and not meaning it, that the usual meaning of that was not as precise.
Well,
as we do it in practice.
Well, it's interesting because if you go back 10 years, optimization as even the name of any of our journals was not used. The Mathematical Programming Society has the society in the journal. And I recall a talk once by Margaret Wright that I heard about 5-7 years ago, where she said one of the smartest things we ever did was start using the word optimization, because now we can explain to other people what it is that we do. And so it's one of the reasons, and I think, as I've been talking more now to lay people and keying on this word, it's been helpful, because if I went to them and said, oh, we do mathematical programming, they have no clue what we're talking about. Going back to the time of the invention of the Simplex method, what kinds of people were you working with at that time?
Well, let me say a few words about this word, mathematical programming. One of the people that was at the Pentagon in those days was a chap, an economist, well known, Harvard professor eventually, and that was Robert Dorfman, Bob Dorfman. And he was after me to use the term mathematical programming and not linear programming. And I felt that the whole way in which economists had set up their models was far, far more general than the linear program. Linear program was a special case. And that in order for the field to progress, we should stick to the simpler term, linear program. So if he was after me right from the very beginning, why not generalize it?
I see.
Why not use a more general term, mathematical programming? And I had the view that you had linear systems. If you think of your mathematical background, you had linear systems, equations that you solved, and then you went to the calculus and the more general mathematical systems. And so that I felt that linear programming was the foundation of the field. You had to be able to solve linear programs first, and then go generalize it. That the economists had generalized it already. So made it so general that you couldn't get your hands on it and use it for practical planning. Because practical planning, such as we were doing in the development of the military during World War II, was essentially linear programs without the objective function. So that was the basis by which we went. And then if you put the objective function, how did they then solve these military systems? Well, they laid out the conditions of the logistical operations, the sorties that were being sought and everything else. And these were all linear programs, but they didn't have anything that was driving them. And how did you then get something to drive? Well, you got a military general to say, well, the objective of our objective is to do the following. So you had all kinds of special rules for achieving an optimum solution, what they defined to be an optimal solution. And they kept thousands and thousands of special rules. And what makes me very nervous about what's going on at the present time is that these computers are so powerful that you can introduce all kinds of special cases, special conditions on the system. It's closer to the way old-fashioned planning was done. Just introduced many, many rules as part of the system. And then I said to myself, well, we can't work with all these rules. Because what it meant is that you set up a plan, and then you had so many rules that you had to get resolution of these rules and statements of what they were, and you'd have to be running to the general and to his assistants and asking them all kinds of questions. What do you want to do? What is your purpose? And of course, the general question is, if you ask, what is your purpose? Well, you say, well, the purpose is to win the war.
Right.
And what do you mean by winning the war? Well, it meant, if you were a Navy guy, it meant building battleships. And so that replaced the objective. You say, well, we're going to build battleships, and then the next question is, how do you build a battleship? And the guy will say, well, we've got to make them 3 inches thick. That became another objective. And so on and on and on, there were these objectives were added in. Because on top of the linear programming, you tried to drive the system by something, and these were ground rules. These were called ground rules.
Now, what would you say brought the word programming into it? I mean, was that a word that was used a lot in the military?
Yes. It's just another word for programming was just another word for planning.
Right. I mean, it's interesting.
This is the program. We're going to have the program was essentially a schedule.
And it's interesting today because the proliferation of the computer and computer programming, people then don't understand that we're talking about a different kind of programming when we speak of mathematical programming.
That's right. The word programming was used and was linear programming was in vogue before programming of computers.
Right.
They were coding. We call it coding for the computer.
So we really maybe we should get the computer programmers to call themselves computer coders.
Yeah, that's right.
What kinds of ideas would you say that you worked on, lines of research, didn't work?
Well, of course, my beef is, and I read your letter very carefully, but I didn't see it anywhere, is nothing in there about the word uncertainty, planning under uncertainty. This, I feel, is the real field that we should be all working on.
Well, and in fact, was your interest, even at the beginning, was to work on those problems?
That's correct.
And I think we've made good progress in that regard. But I think even today, our ability to compute on those problems it's still a challenge.
Well, I don't think you got to first base yet.
Yeah. What people in the field have you admired from? I mean, really, not. I would say I know you've taught a lot of students, including myself, but you've also had the people that you worked with at the time that you admired for the work that they were doing.
I certainly admired some of the pioneers of the field who early realized that it was a field of great potential. So that would be Al Tucker, who you met,
Mm-hmm.
and that whole Princeton group, which consisted of David Gale, Carl Kuhn, and Lloyd Shapley. They were early pioneers in the field. Then the economic group, which were headed up by Charlie Koopmans. Charlie was at the University of Chicago at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Then he moved to Yale. This book was found in Germany. We couldn't find it anywhere around here, but it was found in Germany by someone who is currently writing a PhD on this very subject. This book is a remarkable book. It's called Activity Analysis of Production. Activity Analysis of Production and Allocation. It is proceedings of a conference that was held in 1949.
And this was is now referred to as sort of Symposium Zero.
This is Symposium Zero. And it was the proceedings of the conference 2 years after it started, since it started was 47. So this would be 49. And if you can imagine it as a field that didn't exist in 19... didn't exist in 1947, just started.
Right.
And 2 years afterwards, we had a conference that produced this proceedings. And you can read this book today, and it's just as up to date. Because in those days, everybody who were involved in the war effort and were hungry to do something, suddenly realized this was a new field with great potential. And they began to write papers and do things on the subject.
Now, today, with the internet and the World Wide Web and email, we're able to send papers across the world in a matter of minutes. But back then, there was no internet. It wasn't fax machines. How were people communicating among the various institutions about the work that was going on?
Very quickly. Very quickly.
But you would just have personal meetings, people going by train from institution to institution?
And they would, from time to time, we would have meetings. For example, this was in '49, but it was decided very early to have another meeting soon. And soon meant 3 years. So, like for example, the one that you went into in
Atlanta.
Where was it?
We were in Atlanta last August. Lausanne.
Lausanne, that's right. It was one of, 13th or 14th or 15th
Right.
meeting. But that has been going all the way down from the first one, which was this one. And yet in 3 years from the beginning, it was 2 years from the beginning, people who were involved in the war effort and who had some kind of job, but not what they really wanted to do. And so they were looking for a new outlet, something different. So Koopmans, who was an economist, he was at University of Chicago, Coles Foundation, and he was very influential. And he introduced a lot of people to the whole field. For example, Ken Arrow, which was one of the first people who got the Nobel Prize in economics. Well, he was the second one to get it, the second or third, was there at this conference. I wanted to look up and just read you some of the names of the people who were involved. Ken Arrow was there. George Dantzig was there. Robert Dorfman was there. David Gale was there. I'm just reading you the names of things, people I think you would really know. Al Kuhn was there. Oscar Morgenstern was there. Paul Samuelson was there. Herb Simon was there. Al Tucker was there. Marshall Wood was there. And this was the first group got together. And it was all exactly 2 years from the start of it.
So that must have been pretty exciting.
Well, we all knew that we were on to something.
I guess this was a pretty significant event, but if you look over the history now, going back 54 years, say, what project or event would you say has made you proud of what began back then?
Well, if you ask the question, did we visualize that it would evolve as it did? We all saw that the computer was going to be something. And in our mind's eye, the computer was not much different than it was today. It seems hard to believe.
Yeah, right.
But it's enormous increase in speed that took place. If you ask, well, did we visualize it would speed up like that? Well, probably not. But,
But you knew that it had the power to eventually to solve these kinds of problems.
well, you might ask the question, why didn't linear programming start earlier? Because after all, the systems that we're solving are essentially linear systems.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, no, there was very little interest in the whole field. Theodore Motzkin, who wrote his thesis around 1936, wrote his PhD under Ostrowski, I think, in Switzerland. His PhD thesis was on the inequality system, and yet there was no mention of any optimization.
Right.
No point quite going on the subject, but anyway.
Well, I was asking, what would you say has been the thing that you've seen that makes you sort of proud of the field?
I guess I'm going to have to be a diplomat and say I'm proud of the field.
Okay. Okay. If you could go back and start all over again, would you still think you would make the same choices to work on the same problems?
I guess the answer is yes.
Are there some lines of research that you've tried that you've said that you've regretted and said, oh, we spent too much time here, I wish I'd recognized that earlier? I mean, I know, as a mathematician, I always found, you tried that proof and you spent a few months and you say, this isn't going to work, and then all of a sudden you have the insight of how to solve the problem. Or do you recall things along those lines?
That I made a mistake, and I guess one moves along with one's successes and quickly forgets one's
Right, failures.
failures. Yeah.
What would you say is you've talked about in the future of seeing that you'd like to see more planning under uncertainty. Do you think that that's sort of the next big step for optimization to take?
I would like to see it that way, yes.
Do you explain optimization to people who haven't heard of it?
I would use the example of the gasoline that you put in your car, or use the diet problem.
What would you say is the most invalid criticism of optimization?
I would say that not. How do you know what the planning factors are? They would criticize the formulation.
Okay. And and turning that around, what would you say the most valid criticism of optimization is?
If it was really seriously developed, you could change the world.
what do you think has made optimization being held back from becoming more popular?
The thing that would hold it from being more popular, a feeling that the person hearing it doesn't see what it is in it for him or
I know you've answered this question for me in the past, but I think it would be useful for you to say is, what would you like to be remembered for?
you're talking about posterity.
Yes.
Well, it turns out that my father, who was a mathematician and who wrote popular books on mathematics, was always interested in posterity. He was big on it. And I'm not big on it. I'm not big on it.
Well,
I'd like to say it would be nice to think that I would be remembered for something, but I doubt it.
well, I don't think. I think the field does remember you for a lot of things, and I recall a conversation I had with you a number of years back where that it wasn't the Simplex method, but it was the creation of an objective which we talked about earlier, that you felt was really the key contribution. I was just about to ask you. You had mentioned that you had some papers and things that you wanted to show.
Well, this has to do with my. If you get that red book over there, and in the foreword. I have something here called a summary of my own early contributions. And the first thing is the recognition that most practical planning relations could be reformulated as a system of linear inequalities. So most of what we do with planning, you could be restated as a set of linear inequalities. Before that, it was just people would say, what are the rules, what are the conditions, but not recognize that what they really were setting up was a system of linear inequalities. Mm-hmm. So the very fact that you could formulate it that way, another way of saying it is that you have columns which are activities, and those are the inputs and outputs of various things that you put into the different things that you do. If you're talking about a food, you're talking about the vitamins and minerals and different quantities of things that go into it in fixed proportions. Mm-hmm. And if you're talking about business, almost anything that you do there, it can be broken down into parts, and those parts are statements of inputs and outputs to various activities. Mm-hmm. And that you have a certain quantity of them. So it's a statement of that kind. So the fact that what we're talking about, our linear inequality system, well, that was actually recognized by economists. But they went ahead and said, well, let's make it more general. And so they generalized the hell out of it. And I went back to basics and said, essentially, this is what you do. And this is what actually we did in planning during World War II. We were planning a whole thing that was comparable to running a whole country. The second thing was replacing all those ground rules for selecting good plans by replacing it with an objective function.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing was the inventing of the Simplex method, because it worked.
Right, and it still does.
Well, that's a great accident.
Now, why do you describe this as the great accident?
Well, I certainly, when I worked on it, didn't think that, I thought the old-fashioned techniques for optimization, the whole concepts of it, one of those would win out.
So, what were some of those techniques?
Well, no. Once I realized that the Simplex method was essentially going around the outside of the convex body to get to the optimum, it seemed to me that an interior method should work better.
And now today, actually, we find that it's about 50-50.
Yeah. So trying to even understand why that is even so is quite a surprise to me. It still is.
I think it's still an open question for people working in the field.
Well, you would just think that an interior method would be better.
Right. I think some of the issues, a lot of it depends upon how we measure better. I mean, if we count our number of steps, interior methods are better, but computationally those steps are they're very expensive to compute. So it's like you can quickly move from one vertex to another, but to move from one interior point to another takes a lot of hard work. And if somebody's real smart, maybe they'll figure out a way to make it not so hard to move from one inside to another.
Well, the way I like to say it is our intuition in higher dimensions is pretty poor.
Right. There were some other materials I know you had collected to show us.
I found this. This is by my friend Andrew Vasany, and he's trying to explain how my wife upstaged me.
So, and I think I've heard the story, but would you mind retelling it?
Well, if you look at this picture here, it's pretty crude. You see vinegar, you see molasses, you see bran, and you see bouillon, meaning bouillon cubes. And you see the word Simplex method. And you see my wife's name, Ann Dantzig, spelled wrong. She spells it with an E like the French do. And the story is that I left the Pentagon in 1952, and when I was at Rand Corporation, I decided to use the Simplex method and linear programming to solve the diet problem, but not just the diet problem that Stiegler wrote up, but to apply it to myself. I was a little bit overweight, and so I called up my wife one day and I said, we're going to solve the diet problem for me, George Dantzig, and I want you to be ready when we run it to cook supper and prepare it according to whatever the computer says. So it was getting late in the day, and finally Ann calls me up and she says, "Well, what's for supper?" What's said, well, we ran the program, and it said, I gave her a list of things, and among other things was, the first one on this list, vinegar. And it was a couple of gallons of vinegar and some other stuff was the optimal diet. And I says, well, you're just gonna have to take vinegar out as a food. And that ended that day. So the next day rolled around, and I called her up and I gave her the list of stuff for supper. And among other things was bouillon cubes. Yeah. You know what bouillon is? Good.
Yeah.
Looks like a French name, anyway. French word. So anyway, the bouillon cubes was on there, and it was something like a couple hundred bouillon cubes as part of the diet.
So they were cheap but nutritious.
So cheap? Bouillon cubes are not cheap.
Oh.
I don't think anything would accuse them of being cheap. So Ann said, well, I'll get you the bouillon cubes, but you be prepared to go to the hospital. So I put 5, I said, well, if we're going to get a couple hundred bouillon cubes in a day, we're going to start with 5. So we put 5 of them, and have you ever tasted 5 bouillon cubes?
Oh, if you don't dissolve them, then
You put it in hot water. You pour hot water on it, and it's pure salt.
Salt, right?
It's so salty you just wouldn't believe it. And so I decided that maybe 2 bouillon cubes is about the limit that you could use. And so again, bouillon cubes got out of there, and vinegar got out of there, and the next thing that came up was this one. Each one of these took a day because we've had it.
Because you had to solve by hand.
Well, we were solving it on unmanned computers.
Okay.
But it was just taking it out of the list and resolving. And the bran was about 2 pounds of bran a day. And Ann says, well, you take 2 pounds of bran and a day you'll be in the hospital for sure. So we sort of put it up a pound on it. That's what we did next. And then when you took the bran out, the next thing that came up was molasses. And this is blackstrap molasses. I think molasses is what's used to make sugar, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's got a very strong flavor. And it was just substitute pound for pound for, instead of molasses, bran, you had molasses. And by this time, Ann got tired of the whole business. Because each day I was calling her up and telling her what was for supper. And she said, no, I'll put you on a diet. So she put me on a diet, and that was the end of the story. And my friend Andy Vasny he's a Hungarian with a sense of humor. And so he wrote up a little story about it. His story doesn't match my recollection.
Well, the story is always in the telling.
Well, he knew my father, and his favorite book was my father's famous book called Number. And so he starts out with that.
You were saying about where your father and mother met.
Was at the Sorbonne in Paris. My father studied under André Poincaré. I don't know if that means anything to you.
Yeah.
Yes, Poincaré, yes.
but she probably thinks of him
No,
as a French.
I mean like the president Poincaré.
Yeah, he was the brother of Andre Poincaré.
Okay. Huh.
But the brother was more famous than the president.
So that the baby is you?
That's supposedly me. I don't remember it, of course.
Now, how about some of the other things that you have here?
Well, this is probably the most important thing. This is the National Medal of Science, and it was presented to me by the President of the United States. His name was Gerald Ford. And this is what I got it for. And you can see it's a long time ago.
1975.
That's not too long.
And I think what's very interesting is that in the citation it says, has led to wide-scale scientific and technical applications to important problems in logistics, scheduling, and network optimization. And that's still true today. We're seeing the same growth in those same application areas.
Yeah, I think this citation was written by Pete Vinot.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And let's see, what else I was noticing.
Now
Go ahead.
this medal, this picture here, this medal, is this medal.
Here, yeah.
It's the same. That's the medal. And that's the picture of the medal.
Yeah. Okay.
This particular one over here
Okay.
was given to me by the head of the War Department for my work during World War II.
So this was shortly after the war?
No, that was during the war.
During the war?
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
This medal here was given to me by the English,
This one?
the English Operations Research. Right? From, I think it was University of Maryland.
Okay.
Right, now you're...
Oh, it was a Phi Beta Kappa, I don't remember.
It's Phi Kappa...
Phi Kappa Phi.
Oh, okay. Right, and I think the other one on the right is Phi Beta Kappa, if I'm reading right correctly. And then there's then on the bottom is the von Neumann Theory Prize. I think it was the first von Neumann Prize was given to you. Although I wouldn't know. It was before mine.
I wouldn't know.
Is that an accurate likeness of von Neumann?
Not bad.
Not bad?
Not bad. It's not good, but it's not bad.
Okay. Now you also, I noticed, have for your PhD.
Yes.
You had mentioned earlier about that planning under uncertainty has always been an interest of yours, even going back to when you were working on the foundations of linear programming.
Well, those of us who were doing the planning, right from the very beginning, understood that the real problem was to be able to do planning under uncertainty. Because the mathematical models that we put together act like we have a precise knowledge about the various things that are happening, and we don't. So we need to have plans that actually hedge against these various uncertainties. And we put a little bit of that into the models usually.
Right.
by overstating things, so it would be on the safe side. That's the simplest thing that we can do. But overstating it is almost another way of saying we're going to make it inefficient.
Yeah, would you say, I know there's been a lot of progress, especially over the past 10 years, within the research community on planning under uncertainty. What would you say are the barriers for it to be more widely used in practice?
There's a tendency to do economic planning. For example, in this country, we're no longer making steel in this country. We're importing almost everything that which we have. This shirt comes from someplace, but not in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we don't really hedge, we don't really protect ourselves in case a major emergency. One day we are paying low rates for electricity, and the next thing you know it becomes short. And my bill for utilities, which used to be around $200 or $300, is now $800.
Mm-hmm.
Overnight it just goes through the sky. A lot of things which they call globalization to me look very, very dangerous from the point of view of just protecting the country.
Mm-hmm.
I see our country losing all kinds of skills. We're not hedging and protecting ourselves.